Okay, so deploying stuff, right? So we have this application. Maybe I'll just review the application real quick. We have the people getter one. Okay, so we have this people getter app, which you can use as a model, and it's got three components or three, kind of independent chunks. One of them is a front end, which is an Nginx server. And what's the job of the Nginx server?
I kind of understand it as it packages all the front end together and then runs it, kind of. Not sure exactly how it works.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so the Nginx container, if you look at the architecture diagram, which we don't actually have here, but in the README. So we have the client, and the client is going to be, someone on their browser somewhere, right? So the client is basically the browser. They're going to make an initial request to the web server, which is, I'm going to go to http example.com, whatever. You can have various levels of indirection and everything, but ultimately it's going to hit some kind of web server, and it's going to process that request and send me a response. If it's just like a static HTML page, for example, it's all it is HTML and JavaScript and CSS. There's no additional APIs or anything. Anytime anyone goes to the website, it looks the same, has the same information. That's a static site. If you have a static site, then the architecture is just these two things. The client makes a request to the web server, says, hey, give me an HTML document. The web server responds with an HTML document, and that's it, right? What we're going to be developing is our, more sophisticated applications that have dynamic data and can persist information and update information and delete. So the CRUD, so create, read, update, and destroy. If you want to do that, then there has to be, at the end of the day, there has to be a persistence layer, which is storing data about stuff. And that stuff will be whatever your application is concerned with. But, communicating directly with a database from a web server is, there are things that make that inconvenient. And so we have this intermediate layer, which is called an API. And an API, the job of the API is to take HTTP requests, which could come either directly from the client or from another web server or another API, right? So requests can come into the API from anywhere, depending on how your application is structured. And the API's job, in most cases, is to be the interface, the application programming interface to a database. So rather than having to directly, write queries or something from the front end, you have this layer which can take normal HTTP requests that are formatted in a specific way and that it understands, and then translate those into database interactions. Any questions about the general structure of this? Okay. So we can have this, maybe I should just go ahead and get this working locally real quick, so we can see. Here, and I'm going to pull this down. Okay, so I've got this application open, and the entry point to spin everything up is this script. And this script is going to call some other scripts. So it's going to call the db.setup or the dbsetup.sh. And this is going to build a Docker container and then run it. So fairly straightforward. We have a Docker container for the database. We're going to build it, and then we're going to run it. And then it's going to, once that is set up, it's going to have to, so this is a little hacky. This step that we're doing right now, it's a little hacky. Later on, we're going to use a more sophisticated tool that's going to handle this kind of stuff for us. So the problem that we're having now is that we have lots of containers that need to interact as one application. So coordinating those different containers is a problem, and there are tools like Docker Compose that we'll end up using to handle that. But for now, you have to do this hacky thing where we're going to start the container, and then we're going to say, hey, what IP address are you actually running on? Once we have that, we're going to execute the start API script. And the start API script is just going to build the API and run it. And when it does that, it's going to know how to contact the database container. So the database container is going to start up. Docker is going to assign it an IP address. We're going to grab that IP address and feed it into the API container so that the API container knows where to go to talk to the database. Then, once the database is running and the API is running, we're going to start up the front-end container. And the front-end container, at this point, all it's going to do is just return this HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Okay, so let me run that. So /set start all. Okay, so it's building the database container and running it. Now it's building the API container and running it. And now it's building the Nginx container and running it. So if there were no errors, everything should still be running right now. So I can do Docker PS. I can see that I have these three containers running. People front end, people API, and people DB. So that's great. And we have some port mapping here. So on the front end, we're going to map the host machine's port 80 to the containers port 80. And this is a standard, this is the standard HTTP port. So pretty much anytime you're on the internet and you go to a non-encrypted IP address, whatever, you by default, you're going to go to port 80. It could be anything. This is just the convention. And then here, because of the way we have this set up right now, you're actually going to be making requests directly to port. The front end client is going to be making requests directly to this API. Eventually, we're going to not allow that direct communication, but for now, that's what we're doing. And that's going to be on port 8000. So I should be able to access this web page now. So I'm going to go to localhost, and I could specify port 80, but by default it will be port 80. So I can just do that. I could also, if I want to be very explicit, I can do port 80. So now I'm going to open this up, the inspection, and look at the network request. So now I can click this button, which is going to make a fetch request to the API, which is running on localhost port 8000. I have that port mapped. Okay, so you can take a look at the request. So my request, let's see. Let's see. Yeah, sorry. So made a request to port 8,000. So localhost 127, port 8,000. Okay, so everything's working here. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, so now what I want to do, everything's working locally. I've tested it, I've developed it. I started with, you can do it in any order you want really, but you need to make sure each component is working on its own and test it on its own. And then you want to make sure you can run them all together locally. And once you have them all working together locally, then and only then are you ready to deploy. And deployment is like, there's just a lot of steps. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's difficult from a conceptual standpoint. There's just a lot of steps. And we're gonna use AWS, but you can use, you can do the same thing on any cloud provider. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my AWS account. And I'm gonna sign in real quick. Okay, so here's once I sign in, I've created an account and I've signed in to AWS. So everything that you're gonna do in this course shouldn't require you to pay any money. So everything should be available for free. So if you sign up for AWS, you should get a year worth of the free tier stuff, and we're only gonna use free tier stuff for this program. Okay, so what we want to do is go to EC2. So EC2 is the, rent a computer service. So it happens to show up here because I've recently visited it, but if that's not available for you, you can just do EC2. You can find it there. And then we are going to launch an instance. So you can go here, launch an instance. And when you click that, you're going to have to fill in a form. It's going to ask for specific information about like the properties that you want to have. So that's going to be things like what's the base image that you want to use. And that's called an AMI. So an Amazon machine image, but it's basically just like the operating system that you want. So this is the equivalent of the first line of a Docker file, from Ubuntu, and then you can do everything else from there. So we're going to start with, you can call this whatever you want, but so we're going to start with the base image, and we're just going to use the Amazon Linux because that's going to serve our purposes. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of other ones. If you have very specific needs, you can look those up, but you shouldn't, for this course, you shouldn't need anything other than that. So we're going to do this. You can, if you want to, if you have a newer Mac or whatever and you want to use that, that's fine. And the instance type, we're going to use the T2 micro. Again, this is free, should be free, and it'll be fine for our purposes. The next thing, excuse me, is the key pair. So when you create, this this server, this computer instance in the cloud, creating it just on its own is not enough. What we actually need to be able to do is create it and then go in there and install stuff and configure it and do whatever. So in order for that to happen, we have to create a connection. So I have to create a connection between my host machine and this, server that I've rented from AWS. In order to do that securely, you need to create a key pair. So this is the same system that HTTPS actually uses. So when you go to a web page that's secure, and there's actually a certificate exchange. So you can take a look at least some parts of the certificate. So AWS has a certificate, and that allows my client, my web browser, to communicate using encryption with AWS. So we're going to do the same things, that we're going to have our own certificate that's just for my host machine to talk to this server. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new key pair, and I can call this whatever I want. So and you can use the default here, RSA and .pem, that's fine. So now I have this file here, and I'm just going to pull it onto my desktop right there. You can ignore the other one. So I have the certificate right here. I can, actually, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So I'll open it up in like VS Code. And you can see it's got a bunch of stuff. You can decrypt this and see that basically it's just got a bunch of information. It's just a form. That's really all it is. Okay, so we have that. So now we should be able to communicate securely with the server. So now we have to create some network rules. So this is going to determine like what kind of traffic this server will accept. So SSH traffic. So SSH is how we're actually going to get into the computer, like into a terminal and install things, etc. So we have to allow this, and I'll just restrict it to my IP address. And then we also need to allow HTTP traffic from the internet. So this is going to allow anyone to contact our server on port 80. So HTTP, implicitly, this just means on port 80. That's really all that means. So we're going to allow traffic from port 80 because we need people to be able to go to whatever the IP address on port 80. And you can ignore everything else. All right, so at this point, we should be good to launch the instance. We'll launch the instance. AWS is going to do its AWS magic and spin up this virtual machine. And it will take a minute to spin up. You can see, you can check the status right here. And what we want to do in the meantime, we can take a look at this. So here are all the details. So AWS has assigned my server a public IP address. So I should be able to copy this, paste this into my browser, and go there. Right now, my server isn't prepared to really handle that, but I can do that. Okay. So if we look back at our code now, you can see in app.js that this client, so this right here, it is going to be running on the client. And the client, when I click a button, it's going to make an API call to this address. But we're not running this locally anymore, so it's not going to be localhost. So this, instead of being 127, it's going to be whatever this is. So we're going to have to configure, we're going to have to make a slight change to our code. And this difference between how your code runs in a local environment versus how your code runs in a deployed environment is called configuration. So this is just a general term. So that's what that means. Everything should be exactly the same except for this one thing, or these 5 things, or whatever. So you shouldn't really need to change your code in order to run in a different environment. You should just be able to like replace a couple values. So in a way, you can think of this application as a function, and this entire application is a function, and it takes one parameter, which is the IP address. So there are a few ways of handling this. We'll do something more robust, so you can use environment variables and things like that. That's what we'll use later, especially for sensitive credentials like API keys and things like that. But for now, we'll just manually change this here. Okay. Before I do that, I'm actually going to need to have this in my own repo, because we're going to clone down all of this code into the server, and we're going to run it. We're going to run the start all script on the server. So in order for Git to easily access this, we're going to make this a public repo. So I'm going to take this code that I've already written, and this code is in a private repo. So I'm just going to remove the .git file and start over, and then push it up to my personal account so it's public. So rm-rf. Okay, so I just removed the .git folder, so this is no longer a Git project. I'm going to reinitialize it. So first off, I'm going to make this change. Okay. So git init, git add, git commit. Okay, and now I'm going to go to my personal GitHub account. And I'm going to create a new repo. Call this make it a public repo. And then I'm going to copy this. And I'll refresh this. So this code change should be available here. If I look in the front end, I should see the IP address associated with the server that I just created. All right, so my code is now ready to be deployed. We have to now go into the instance and prepare it. So what are we going to have to do to prepare this generic operating system to handle our code? Well, we're going to need to install Docker so that we can run everything. And at least right now, we're going to need to install Git so that we can clone down the repo. So I'm going to go down here. Actually, before we do that, we're going to have to SSH in. So let's do that first. So you can, yeah, okay. So this is running. It takes like 30 seconds to spin up, but this is running now. So I'm going to click this connect button, and it's going to allow me to easily just copy this command. So all you need to do is SSH in, and we're going to supply the credential. So this -i SSH key.pem. This is the file that we're going to use to ensure that we're allowed access this machine. And here is the IP address. This is the format. This is the default user that this particular image creates. And here is the IP address. Okay. So, and if you read this, it's going to tell you that before you do this, you have to change the permissions. You basically have to restrict the permissions of the SSH key. So this SSH key, which we just saw, is on my desktop. So I'm going to cd back into my desktop, and I'm going to run chmod right there. And I can do ls-l. And I can see that the key is right here, and that this has very restricted permission. So only the root user is allowed to read this. Okay, so now I can copy this command. I can go here, and I will say yes. So now I'm connected. I'm inside this computer that I've rented from AWS. And I should be able to do any normal, so cd. So this is just a normal Linux file system. I can do any Linuxy stuff. It has all the basic utilities installed in it and so on. So cd ec2 user. So what I want to do now is install Docker. This over. All right, so I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to just copy this command, which is going to install Docker and Git. And I'll paste that in. It should do its thing for a few seconds. Okay, so that's done. So I should have Docker and Git installed here. So I can check that. So git -- version. Okay, so that's there, and Docker -- version, and that is there. Okay, so this machine is now prepared to run my Dockerized application. So in order to do that, I need to copy over my source code here so that I can run it. So I'm going to go to my repo and copy this, and then I can just do git clone. So git clone. Copy that. Do ls, I can see that it's there. So I'm going to go in there, and then I should just be able to run the start all script. So let's see if that works. So /start all. Okay, so far it looks like it's working. Because this is running on a brand new machine, none of the Docker images are cached or anything. So you're gonna have to download everything. So the first time you run it, it'll take a minute. But we'll see. It should run everything exactly the same as on the host machine. Any questions while this is building? So the eventual goal, we're going to use Docker Compose to coordinate everything. And you're also going to have your images pushed up to your Docker Hub account. So you won't actually have to clone your source code here, but this is kind of an intermediary step. All right, so we can check if this is running now. So Docker PS should have 3 containers running. So it should look basically identical to how it looked on our local machine. So we have the same port mapping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so now we want to see if this actually works. So we can test it out by going, I'm going to go back to the instances. I'm going to grab this IP address, and I should be able to go here, make sure that it's not HTTPS, make sure it's just regular HTTP, make the request, and it worked, right? So we went to this, we're accessing this deployed version of the application from this address, and we can actually go there. So I'm going to open up the network tab, and I'll refresh this. So here's our request going out there. You can see the request headers. We're making the requests over there, and you can see the response, which obviously is an HTML document. Okay, so now what we want to do is, so that initial calls is working, which means that we have all of the AWS infrastructure stuff set up correctly, and 2, that our Nginx server is working, right? So we know that some things are working. It looks like all the containers are running. It looks like everything is up. We have permission to contact the server on port 80, and we're getting a correct expected response from the Nginx container running on that server. But now we need to test the API. So the API, if we click this button, it's going to make a request to, should be this IP address, but on port 8000. So let's see if that works. So it looks like it's just kind of hanging there. So we have potentially an issue. So here is the request URL that I made, right? So that looks right? It's the IP address that we have, and it's going to port 8000/all. So that looks right. So the URL is correct. So let's try, maybe there's something wacky going on with the browser. So let's just use curl maybe. So curl. And that's also just hanging. So let's try it with -v. And it says it's trying this. So what's happening here is basically we didn't explicitly give this this server permission to accept requests on port 8000. We only gave it permission to accept requests on port 80. And unfortunately, you're not going to get any helpful response. It's just not going to work. So what we have to do is we have to modify this instance a little bit and give it permission to accept requests on port 8000. So I can go to networking, and what we're going to have to do really is go to the security tab, and the security group. This is just an AWS thing, but we have to go into the security group, and we have to say, hey, you can also go on, you can also accept traffic from port 8000. So right now, here are the inbound rules. So this is rules like from outside clients, like my Chrome browser right here. So it will accept requests on port 2022, which is the SSH port. So we saw that that is working. And we also saw that port 80 is working because it's getting a response from the Nginx container. We need to add another rule here. So I'm going to click on this security group. and I'm going to add an inbound rule. So edit inbound rules. And I'm going to add a rule. Do HTTP. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to do all traffic, which is not the most secure, but so this will basically allow any kind of traffic from anywhere. So you could set up specific ports and so on, but it doesn't really matter in our case. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And now I should be able to look at the rules and see, okay, now basically we're allowing all traffic anywhere. So if I go back to my application now and hit this endpoint again, so first off, I can try it with curl. And I get a response now. So I can directly contact the API. So I know that I know that I have the correct permissions to actually make the request to the server, and that on the server, the API container is working, it's correctly talking to the database, and it's correctly sending the response that we expect. So if I now run this in the application, I can see all of the data. I can also get particular instance. So that's the basic idea. So there's a few tedious steps you have to go through. You have to create an instance. You have to configure it a little bit. The default stuff is pretty much all you're going to need. You'll have to have a key pair. You can either generate a new one, or you can, like, if you have one saved, you can just reuse that one over and over again. And then you have to install Docker and Git, and then just run it. So if it works locally, it should work when it's deployed. Any questions about that? Okay, so the free tier allows you to basically run one of these T2 micro instances all the time. So if you want to always have one up, that's fine. If you're playing around and testing stuff and you want to create multiple ones, you should make sure that you're stopping the containers periodically, because it's based on how many like instance hours you use in a month. In general, it's good to make sure you clean up resources. So this is just a demo. It's not like, oh, I have my application deployed and I want, employers to come look at it. If that's the case, you want it up all the time. But as we're developing stuff, it's a good idea to just remove resources when you're done with it. So I'm done with this. I don't need this anymore. So I'm going to terminate the instance. And I'll terminate it. And now it's done. That's it. And if if it didn't work or whatever, or if I wanted to make some changes, it's real easy. I can make my changes in the code. I can spin up another instance. It's all like, everything is very disposable. And the whole point is to develop applications that you can do this. You can quickly make a code change, quickly redeploy, and everything should just work pretty smoothly. It should take you, 5 minutes to redeploy a totally new version of your application. Okay. So I will immediately put this video on YouTube in case you guys want to reference it. It's a lot of steps. The README that should also have the same information in it. So that's it. If you get stuck anywhere, please, give it a solid effort, but don't waste time. Yeah, don't waste time on like, I can't get AWS to work. So just please ask if you have an issue with that.